All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s, when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. This episode is brought to you by Progressive, where drivers who save by switching save nearly $750 on average. Quote now at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates, national average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, December 5th, 1962, comedian Lenny Bruce is arrested in Chicago after a week of performances at the Gate of Horn Club. I just like the name of that club. It doesn't really matter, but Gate of Horn Club, cool name for a club. We've talked a bit on this show about how obscenity laws and the various legal and cultural norms that swirl around them in different eras have kind of run into these questions about what is artistic expression and when does artistic expression cross the line, legal or cultural. And Bruce was a comedian who was all about crossing that line. This was not his first run-in with the law or his last. But this particular moment is interesting because of the nature of the line that he crossed. It's not that he was necessarily crude or obscene, but it seems as if what got Bruce in trouble in the winter of '62 in Chicago was basically making some jokes about religion and comparing it to big business. And you cross those two forces at a particular time in a particular place, and you are in real trouble. So let's talk about Lenny Bruce and this raid and his kind of legacy of crossing lines and what it says about how those lines get sorted out over the years. Here to do that, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So I guess we should say ostensibly, and whenever you're talking about people getting arrested, there's always the ostensibly. Ostensibly, this raid of this club was to catch underage patrons of the club. That was like at the end of the day, they were like, well, we think there's people who are underage in this club, and so we're going to, end the show. They cut the show off mid-show and said, show us your IDs, and they found one 15-year-old there, so I guess they did nab a truant or whatever. But it seems clear that there was this larger thing going on about Lenny Bruce and some lines he had crossed. So what is your sense of what was really going on?
Well, look, Lenny Bruce had been arrested many times before this moment. I mean, he had been arrested for narcotics, but he'd also been arrested for violating obscenity laws. Now, he had been found not guilty in previous cases, but he had been on the radar of officials in Chicago, not only because, as you were saying, of the obscenities he used, which were pretty blue for the era, but because of these insults against the Catholic Church. And where is he? He's in Chicago. Chicago is pretty Catholic town. It is a place Irish. Where that's right. And you know who's especially Irish in Chicago? Police officers.
Yes.
And they do not take kindly to his remarks about the Catholic Church.
No, and he's always, the issue is he's consistent, and two, he's always walking the line, always walking the line with his comedy. And one of the things that really is a line in this moment is the Catholic Church and big business. And he sort of, does a 1-2 punch with both of these big issues. To talk against someone's faith, particularly the Catholic faith, was such a faux pas. And to do it with comedy, he made himself sort of an easy target for the police to come after him.
Yeah, that mixing of the sacred and profane, which is something I think we take for granted these days. It's just commonplace, was much more of a taboo then.
And in some of the reporting at the time, it sounds like, there was, I guess, one cop who had it out for him and basically said, like, I'm a Catholic. Don't make these, you keep making these jokes. You're gonna have trouble with me. And, and so that's all it takes is, but, I do suppose this gets us to a sense of like what kind of comedian Lenny Bruce is. And I think like at the end of the day, this is a story a little bit about artistic expression, as we've been talking about, pushing up against these lines and cultural norms and laws and so forth. And, I think Lenny Bruce is generally thought of as one of the first comedians who really exploded the idea of what comedy is and was really doing a lot of storytelling and social commentary, with humor, but it wasn't, set up, punchline. And I went back and watched some of, his routines or his work. And, a lot of it is sort of like avant-garde-ish theater at times. And we've come to understand that when you're in that mode, you're often sort of punching up and taking and sort of examining core institutions. But I don't think that was necessarily an understanding at the time that like, yeah, the job of a comedian is to go up there and sort of do some truth telling. And what are you going to do truth telling about? Well, you're going to do truth telling about the big, powerful forces. Well, those are business and religion and so forth.
Yeah. And I honestly think if he had just stuck the route of big business, it probably wouldn't have attracted so much, scorn. But anytime that you step into the religious arena, I feel like you're really setting yourself up for failure. And to try to also tether the church to big business in a way, to show the church is either corruption or, some dealings or whatever, people are not going to be for that.
And the reason that the obscenity question comes in here is because there is still a First Amendment in this period, and even though it is not as widely interpreted as it is today, like we have so many more First Amendment protections than they did in the early 1960s. There's been a lot of legal development in that area. Insulting someone's religion wasn't a crime, but obscenities still were. The Supreme Court had started to loosen up just a little bit on it. But in the case of Lenny Bruce, like he could still be arrested for using the F word or using any of these words. And so there was a way, and speaking of like telling truth to power or punching up, what greater example of punching up and your sort of moral commitment to it than willingly breaking this law and saying,
yes.
like, you're doing it because of it's your freedom. It's your right to.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a good reminder that, yes, he was up there also just like spouting a lot of obscenities at times too. And certainly in a couple years later, he gets arrested in New York, I think, which is probably the more famous arrest. And in that one, it's because in a single night, I think he utters over 100 obscenities from stage. And,
that's a lot.
And there's particular words that he knows he's going to get in trouble for, and he uses them, and then he does riffs about how he got in trouble for using them. He'd like to stick the finger in the eye.
And it's worth mentioning, this is part of how he came up in comedy. Some of his big gigs in earlier eras were in strip clubs. He even once did a show just wearing black socks. So this is someone who was used to operating outside of, the most regulated parts of society.
Yeah.
But I think that, Lenny Bruce is really like setting a precedent for other comedians that will follow suit, such as George Carlin, who's in the audience, who's 25 years old and in the audience when he's arrested, which I kind of think is amazing.
Yeah. There's a great photo of Bruce getting arrested and George Carlin's like wandering in the background. Yeah.
That's awesome. And I also think it's, other comedians that come after this sort of pick up that mantle a little bit. Like I think about Richard Pryor and how Richard Pryor always walked the line with language that he used and the topics that he talked about. And I think people also get more and more fascinated by comedians that push the edge or are willing to push the edge a little bit, as much as it's troublesome. I don't know. We sort of have this appetite for it.
And I think is often the case with discovering artists of any kind. Like, one thing is often like, who are the people you admire? Who did they admire? And that was my entry to Lenny Bruce, was like, oh, this is the guy that particularly George Carlin and Richard Pryor idolized. And so it's like, that was how I first heard about him.
And it also acts as sort of this moment as a Rosetta Stone for understanding someone like Carlin's comedy. Because if you hear today his routine, the 7 words you can't say on television, it's so outside of the scope of most people today's experience with media, right? Like, people say anything that they want, and there are really very few repercussions for it, that you don't necessarily have the context for why not only he was doing this routine, but why he was so committed to it. And that photo that you're talking about, Jody, of him being there while Bruce is being arrested, helps make sense of it, not just as a comedy routine and not just as social commentary, but something that had shaped his career from these very early days.
This is an aside, but I think George Carlin doesn't live in the public imagination in a way that he should. And I think there's so many of the conversations we're having now can be solved by just going back and listening to George Carlin. But I think there is a Judd Apatow produced docuseries about Carlin coming out soon, and I hope it really thrusts Carlin back into our consciousness. But anyway, one thing about Lenny Bruce that I sort of get a sense from reading this is that he was also, I don't think this is the right phrase, but he was like a bit of a code switcher in that, or he was able to navigate different worlds. Like, he could also do the very straightforward on like just sort of like mass TV, pretty standard middle America. I think there was a part of America that just saw him as like a very straightforward comedian, and then he also pushed the edges, which I think allowed more sort of avant-garde and more sort of younger generation folks to attach to him. And when he gets arrested, for instance, you get this really interesting sort of coterie of, I'd say, up-and-coming artists from like Allen Ginsberg to Elizabeth Taylor and James Baldwin and Bob Dylan all come to his defense. And, would they have come to the defense of someone who was just much more explicitly an outsider and, only pushing the envelope over and over and over, but rather, Lenny Bruce was galvanizing in an interesting way because he did have a sort of that range.
No, I get it. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that the fact that he is pushing the envelope with comedy allows people to also think about or imagine how they might also push the envelope in their music, in their poetry, in their writing, whatever it is. And so I do think that there's respect that people have for someone that is willing to get arrested over and over again, and not just for like, something silly or superficial, but like the ability to sort of be able to speak your mind uncensored, and to even more importantly speak truth to power. I think that means something.
And this obviously isn't just happening in the comedy world. Not only is this in the middle of this national phase of the Black Civil Rights Movement, but in 1964, you have the birth of the free speech movement at Berkeley, which is a big part of the student and anti-war movement of the 1960s. And so these same dynamics that Bruce is playing with are central to the political fights of the era.
Yeah. One thought as we wrap up is, it really does seem, and I guess it's both the larger culture is changing, but also it seems like Lenny Bruce did sort of shift the paradigm a little bit. But it does feel like after Lenny Bruce, he just sort of like moved the window to what the understanding of comedy was. And it's not like there were a ton of comedians getting arrested after Lenny Bruce, and like the George Carlins could come up with an expectation that, yes, this is sort of what a comedian does. It's kind of remarkable how much he was able to just sort of shift things and flip a switch in a sense. Yeah.
Can I just give a shout out to the show The Marvelous Miss Maisel? Because if you haven't seen it, it's so good. But Lenny Bruce is sort of a reoccurring character that comes up in the show and really shapes Maisel's own comedy within the show.
Yeah. Yeah, it captures that shift, that particular early 60s shift that was happening in music as well, and all sorts of places, of like very stodgy old style comedy and art, and then this sort of new edgier stuff, and it's all like colliding and people don't know what to make of it. And
the fall of the Borscht Belt and the rise of this kind of observational comedy.
Exactly. So let's come back to the arrest. Bruce is arrested a number of times. This time a couple years later, as we said, in New York. What happens to him? Is it just a show arrest?
He's arrested. He's arrested. He's taken to trial. He is convicted and found guilty, and pretty much has to serve time. But the punishment is to work 4 months in a workhouse, to be put to hard labor, essentially. So he still has to, pay consequences for this act.
Yeah.
And this also is at the point at which his struggles with addiction and with heroin start to escalate. And so it's not long after his arrest and his imprisonment that he ultimately dies of a drug overdose. And he's quite young at the time. He's like 40 years old. So he has this very intense but brief life.
Yeah. And the financial pressures of getting arrested a handful of times in just a couple years. I mean, it all comes crashing down. Okay, so we'll wrap up here. But, 2003, there was a campaign to posthumously pardon him. Governor Pataki granted the petition to do so. This was 37 years after Bruce's death. So, and again, as we're saying, sort of his stature in the public imagination has only grown and grown and grown since then. So, yeah. Okay. Well, that brings us to the end of the episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Kaula Nakua helps with transcripts. Julie Shapiro is executive producer for Radiotopia. Get in touch with us if you have any questions or comments or ideas for the show. You can email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com, where you can also get our full archives, transcripts, and learn lots more about the show. Follow us on social at thisdaypod on Instagram and Twitter, where we are posting stuff each and every day. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
The bust. What I got arrested for in San Francisco. San Francisco, I got arrested for, what I think, we can hear that, Daddy. I'm not going to repeat the word because I want to finish the gig here tonight. It's the 10-letter word. And he comes over and he says, Lenny, my name is Sergeant Bumba. You know the word you said? I said a lot of words that time. Well, that word. Oh, yeah. Well, Lenny, that's against the law to take it down. Okay, that's cool. It's against the law to say it and to do it. Well, I didn't do it, man. I know, but...
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. If you feel like you're wasting time and money with your current business software, or just want to know what you could be missing, then you'll need to join the millions of others who have switched to Odoo. Odoo is the affordable, all-in-one management software with a library of fully integrated business applications that help you get more done in less time for a fraction of the price. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Odoo, modern management made simple.
Radiotopia from